Tape Deck Media.
My friend Dan, he's got a podcast, cause all comics need a podcast, and nobody had a podcast called The Art of Bombing. So Dan went out and bought a tape deck. Who knows why he bought a tape deck? Podcasts don't get played on tape decks, but Dan is from the 80s. So hey there, all you funny jerks, come talk to Dan about your work. Tell him all about your worst times. It's The Art of Bombing.
Welcome to an all-new episode of Between Bombs Callbacks, where Josh and I call back the most recent episode. This week, we are calling back episode 296 with Ralph Anthony. And if you can't tell by now, I am struggling to talk.
You sound like you're 296, right?
I sound what?
You sound like you're 296.
I am. That's how I feel.
That is how old you sound right now. You sound
Full
like
disclosure. I had Snow Jam Comedy Festival last weekend. I was out there for the whole week, getting ready, doing it. I ran myself a little ragged, probably drank more than I should have, did a lot of unhealthy eating, and now it's catching up to me.
well, since this is now officially all your fault. Like no sympathy, like I just have to just give you crap about this for the entire episode.
And that's, you know,
like
what? That's fair.
Starting with
I deserve it.
Starting with the fact, like, I mean, come on, like, we got it. Like, I need a host that's like partially alive. Are you alive?
I'm partially alive. I can check that box.
Okay. All right. Good.
Honestly, I sound worse than I feel.
Oh, okay.
So
there's
that. So I don't really feel that bad. I just can't talk very well.
You
but
also
I don't
sound
feel
worse
terrible.
Well, good episode with Ralph Anthony last week. Definitely some things in there. I thought that there were a few topics. One was how comics, when they're reviewing their material, tend to focus a little too much on what doesn't work. Have you ever done that?
Oh, God, all the time. I'm more concerned. It's just like when you make up, or when you have that one joke that doesn't land, or you mess a word up, and you get off stage, and overall it was a good set, but you can't stop thinking about that one thing you screwed up.
Yeah.
Always going through my brain. I'm always like, oh, and I do that. I feel like when it comes to writing jokes, the ones that don't work, I kind of start obsessing over because I want to get them to work. It becomes like, that obsession. Excuse me. That obsession.
Oh my God.
I just can't talk very well.
Well, I get obsessed as well in the same way, and I'm sure you can relate to this. Like when you're out there and you're doing your thing and you're crushing, but there's one guy that doesn't look like he's having a good time, and like that is the one person you're focused on. Yeah, you're doing a good job of that right now. Like just like the energy that gets sucked out of the room with one guy, and every comic focuses on that one person, that one joke.
Yep, absolutely. Yep, and I know I've definitely done that, because it's easy to, like, you can be in a room full of 100 people, 99 of them are having a good time, but that one person, just like, oh, stop that.
Yeah, it happens a lot, and when we're reviewing our material is probably when it's the most damaging, right? Because that's when we start, to your point, obsessing about one small thing and forgetting the success of all the other things that were there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point. And you need to, definitely need to keep that in mind, when you're working on your material. If you have something that just isn't working, maybe just put it away for a little while and come back to it at another time. Because I don't know how it is for you when you're writing, but one thing I have found is that sometimes when I'm working on something and I just can't get it to where I want it to be, I shelve it for a while and then pick it up down the road, and then suddenly, oh, now I know what I need to do to make this work.
Yeah. And he makes another point that I think is related to this, where you get into some crowd work. And we've discussed crowd work on this show several times before, but the specific reference to it in this case is he uh, talks about crowd work. And you brought up a good point, which was like, there are comics who focus so much on like one individual, like
Hmm.
kind of like picking a joke to obsess over and keep working on the same joke that really just isn't there right now. Our time might be better served moving on to something else that might be closer or that we might actually enjoy doing more. Instead of doing that, we obsess about the one joke. But there's also like comics that do crowd work that just focus on one individual, and the one individual just isn't into it, doesn't like
Hmm.
crowd moving on, just hovering on the one person, and then it becomes about why they don't want to participate, and then it becomes personal and they get not okay, but the comic won't leave it, and this tension starts to fill the room. Like, that was a piece of it that, you know, plays out with our interactions with the crowd that I thought was right in the same ballpark as this.
Absolutely. And you're right. That's something I pointed out when we did the crowd work episode, where we were talking a lot about crowd work. I pointed out that when we're talking about what makes good crowd work, and one of my points was to not focus. If one person does not want to be involved, move on.
Yeah.
Don't keep obsessing over them, because you are, like you said, you're going to make the energy in the room awkward. You're going to make them not have a good time. You're going to, and that's it. And the rest of the audience will feel that, and that'll suck all your good energy out. And it's going to end up ultimately making you look like the bad guy.
Yeah, that's right. Because now all of a sudden the person you're berating is a victim. I've seen it happen.
Hmm.
I was I was doing a country club thing one time where like
Ooh,
lots of
fancy.
different people. It seemed like it was going to be fancy, and we got there and they were like, "Man, you guys sold 40 tickets, room's full, awesome." And it was just a bunch of drunk old people, and they were just all there, like
That checks
they
out.
all knew each other. It's just the worst. It's the worst environment possible, and they just sucked as a crowd. And I get up, do my thing, and I bring up the feature. He does his thing. I come back out. I bring up the headliner. Headliner jumps up there and just goes straight into crowd work, which, to Ralph's point, the situation probably called for a little bit, right? We got to kind of get into the crowd, maybe work some of that energy out, and then organically, seamlessly blend that back into the material. But instead of doing that second part, he just focused on this one lady until she became really not okay.
Hmm.
But unfortunately, this entire room knew who the lady was. It's like Rita, right? Like, she lives down the street. Like, everybody knows Rita. So he just kept going on her, and he just lost him. And it didn't matter how good his material was or what other things he had to prepare. Like, it all just went to hell once he started going in on one person, and the audience became defensive.
Yeah, which is
Just
never
lost
good.
everybody.
You did.
Yeah,
I mean, and
it's
that's
not.
and that's something that can definitely happen, especially in environments like that, especially small towns where everybody knows everybody. If you start railing into one of their friends and it comes off
Mhm.
more mean than playful, you're going to lose them all,
Right.
and
It's a
it's
good way to
and
lose
it's
a
really not
crowd.
worth it. And it's not worth it.
Yeah. Yeah. So the other thing he brings us that I thought was a good thing to call out here was, you ask every guest, like, analyzing material, how do you do that? What's your
Hmm.
process? And he gave us something that we haven't heard very often, which was, you need time, space, and grace. You need time and space to analyze your stuff. Grace to understand that, hey, you know what? Maybe this joke isn't there and I need to move on. Or grace meaning, hey, let's be gracious enough to realize that some of the set did go well. But really, the time and space is what helps us realize that third thing, right? So, in other words, if I have a show, whether it's good or bad, I'm emotionally connected to it right afterwards. everything that just happened to me is still on me. It is bad. It was a bad thing. It was a good thing. I'm still wearing it. And when I go back and listen to it now, I'm going to hear everything that I'm feeling, right? The laughs aren't there, all those different kinds of things. But once you can give yourself a little bit of space so you can get back into your sort of thinking brain, your frontal cortex, where you can actually do some analysis without being so tied to how it emotionally felt to go through it, all of a sudden you're going to find things that you can use to make the set better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you can't get it, it's an old writing cliche, but you can't get attached to your babies. You have to be able to kill your
Yeah.
babies, they say. And, it's true. And it kind of goes into what we were talking about earlier about obsessing over what's not working and, being able to, shelving it and then coming back to it. It's kind of the same thing. You need to take a breath, let it, just kind of let it stew and then come back and taste it, see. And because like you said, you'll have, if you're super attached right away, you're not going to analyze it in an objectively way. And in order to really improve that joke or that material, you need to look at it objectively, and you need to not be attached.
Right. So, the way to detach is really just time. I don't think
Mm-hmm.
there's no technique really that you can employ to try to think differently about something that just happened to you.
Yeah. I really like
you
the time, space, and grace. That is a great way to describe it.
Right. Yeah, the time to disconnect from it, the space, like the mental space to be able to shift gears into an analysis mode, and then the grace and kind of just let yourself off a little easy, man. Like it doesn't have to
Mm-hmm.
be like this time to beat yourself up or feel bad about it. In fact, on the show, the episode, he describes like, after I give myself a little time, a lot of the bombs that I thought I had, or the times where I didn't think a set went that well, I go back and I listen to it, and it turns out it wasn't that bad.
Mm-hmm. I had a good example of that is for me is the show that I did that got me to do this podcast. I listened to the set like a year later, and it wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it was in the moment. It was still
Right.
not great, but it was not as
Yeah.
bad as I thought.
Well, when you listen to something a year later or 2 years later, you're gonna not think it's great always, but for a different
Yeah.
reason, right?
Yeah,
Because
because
you've
you
progressed as a comic.
and
You're
hopefully
you're
evolved.
better.
Yeah,
Yeah, you've
exactly.
evolved. Yeah, if you listen to something, a year later, 2 years later, and you think it's amazing, that might be a bad sign that, you like your perspective is still what it was then. So it's healthy to find things to improve, but you have to do it to Ralph's case. You have to do it without the emotions involved. And the time is really what creates that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think that I mean we really dug in. This isn't as long as an episode as we normally do for these callbacks. I do apologize, but I know Josh is like, Dan, you need to stop talking. So
You
uh,
might die, guys. Like if we want more art of bombing episodes to come, and I'm telling you guys, we gotta let Dan watch some reruns of MacGyver or something and just get the
exactly.
incredibles first.
We're almost episode 300. We don't want Dan to die before episode 300.
We're almost there, guys. We're gonna make it.
We're almost there. We're almost there. All right. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Between Bombs Callbacks. Next week, we will be back with an all new episode of the regular podcast. Our guest is James Stanley, fantastic comedian that I knew from the Twin Cities. So that's what's going to be coming up next week. Make sure you like, subscribe, follow the podcast wherever you get podcasts. And if you're just a quick plug for myself, if you're a big comic book person, I'm launching a new podcast with my friend, former guest of the show, Jeremy Plum, called the Panel Picks, and it is a podcast about comic books. And basically, it's going to be a weekly guide into what's coming out each week. So if you love comic books, go check out my new podcast, Panel Pods. And we will be back next week.
This has been a Tape Deck Media production. Thank you for listening.